Do you ever find yourself in a position where you're not sure what to talk about next on your podcast? You're not sure where your next content idea is going to come from. It's a big issue. It keeps you from posting, it keeps you from being consistent. Well, I got you because in today's episode, I'm going to share with you 3 ways that you can ensure that you will never, ever, ever run out of podcast content again. So stay tuned.
What's up? I'm Angie, and you are listening to Podcast That Pays, the podcast for online business owners who want to grow their business and sell their offers using podcasting. If you like no fluff, tell it like it is advice from a marketing-loving podcast agency owner, you are in the right place. So glad you're here. Let's dive in.
So, one of the biggest things that I find that holds people back from being consistent with their podcast is the fact that they quite simply run out of ideas for their content. They quite simply just run out of shit to say. Personally, I've never had the issue because I'm always full of shit to say. I always have something to talk about when you shove a microphone in my face. Has never ever been a problem. But after working with hundreds of entrepreneurs and podcasters creating their podcasts, I find that this is actually a really common problem. It's a really common thing that we go through. So if you are someone who struggles with this, just know that you are not alone, even though I do not share the same issue. I can talk for days and days and days about everything. So I'm going to share with you some of the things that I have used, some of the ways that I've helped my clients to generate content ideas here in this episode. So make sure that you jot these down, quite honestly, because they actually are really valuable and can come in really handy for you. Okay, so number one, the first way and the first thing that you can do to never run out of content ideas is you can source questions directly from your audience. So if you've noticed, if you are a fan of this podcast and listen all the time, I have started the Ask Angie segments. That is coming directly from questions that people ask me, right? Now, I directly ask for questions sometimes, and so that's where I pull those questions from. But other times, it's questions that people will leave on my social media posts. It's conversations that I'll have with people and they'll ask me questions. I've learned to become really diligent about collecting questions. And this, when I was first transitioning my business from a life coach. If you did not know, I used to be a life coach. Then I started my first podcast, Get Happy AF with Angie Jordan. It's still alive and still alive today, even though I have not added anything to it. But when I transitioned from life coach to podcast, and I was trying to nail my messaging and understand what people are wanting to know about podcasting, I paid very close attention of questions, so much so that I kept a Google Doc of questions that people were asking. So, because I did that, anytime I went to write content, I always had content to write. I always knew what to say. And I was actually what made that really valuable. And I did it without really thinking about it and what makes it valuable. But what makes it so valuable is that when you are creating content that is not about you and is literally about the people, your clients, your people who you're here to serve, it makes your content way more potent, way more powerful. And it actually, you always have the finger on the pulse of what people are wanting, needing, thinking. And so it always is relevant content to them. So your content is never irrelevant. Your content is always going to be really, really good and people are going to consume it because you're literally taking from the questions that people are actually asking right now. So very, very, very good way to create content. So if you're not in this practice already, get yourself a Google Doc. And every time you see a question about podcasting or someone asks you a question, add it to the Google Doc because it's going to be very valuable content for you. Now, if people aren't asking you questions, maybe when I was newer to my transition from life coach to podcast coach, people weren't asking me questions because people didn't know what I was doing. And so what I did was I went into Facebook groups about podcasting. I searched the word podcast, or I went into business groups. I searched the word podcast and I found all the questions that people were asking about podcasting. I still do this sometimes. I still do this every now and again. I go in, I look to see what people are talking about, what people need, that kind of thing from their podcast. I grab questions, put them in the Google Doc so that I could answer them here and on TikTok. Funny enough, this topic is something that I talked about on TikTok, and this is kind of the first time that I'm taking an actual TikTok that I created and I'm creating a long form content, which is this podcast, versus how I usually will do it, which is I take my TikTok content from what I talk about on my podcast. So just funny story, but I did create this on TikTok and I got so many saves and so many likes that I knew that it was really relevant content to people and that people really struggled with this, right? So again, paying attention to what your audience is wanting, what are they resonating with, what are they asking? Obviously, people were resonating with this content and struggle with this. So that is why I decided to turn it into a whole podcast episode instead of just a riff on TikTok. So that's number one. Number one is, what are people talking about? What are people resonating with? What are people asking you questions about? Collect those. Become a question collector. Okay. Become a curator of questions that your audience is asking. And I promise you, your content is going to be great and people are going to resonate with your content if you create it in this way. So that's the first thing that you can be consistently doing to never run out of podcast ideas. Hey, if you're listening to this and you're thinking to yourself, I really need to up my podcasting game, or you want to start utilizing your show more for your business to get more leads and sell more offers, then I want you to come over to podcastthatpays.com and check out the Podcast Collab Lab. That's podcastthatpays.com and check out what we're doing over there. I would love you to join us. Okay, back to the show. Number 2 is you can always be taking content from your framework and turning that into podcast episodes. So this can be pillars of how you work with people, how you take people from point A to point B. Let's say it's a 3-step process. So now let's take those 3 steps and let's break them down and talk about them in a podcast episode. Now, this is not one of those moments where we're like, well, Angie, what if I'm giving it all away on my podcast? What would I share inside my programs? Like, I'm just here to tell you that I do not believe in gatekeeping, or that if you share too much information that people then won't hire you. People hire you for your expertise, for your accountability, for your guidance, for how you put things together in a way that they can go through them. People, there's information everywhere. Like, what you do can probably be Googled, to be quite honest, but it's how you help them apply it to what they do and what they need that is unique. So you sharing your framework, it only highlights your expertise. It doesn't discourage people from purchasing from you. Okay. So and you have to also understand the platform. Like, this is not, people are not taking notes. This is not a master class. It's not a workshop. This is a podcast. Like, we're walking around picking up our dog shit while we're listening to podcasts. Like, this is a different type of interaction. So it's okay to share. But what I will say is that we're not teaching. You have to be careful when you do these framework episodes. You have to be careful to not teach. And it's, again, not because we don't want to teach them the things. It's just because the nature of the platform and what we need to be doing in order to keep people engaged. And it's not teaching. It's, let's shift people's beliefs. Let's inspire people. Let's motivate people. Let's make people think differently about things, right? So whatever pieces of your framework, let's pop in a piece of that framework and let's maybe talk about a common misconception about that piece of your framework, and let's show them why that's a misconception, and let's teach them something else to believe, right? Let's shift their beliefs on that. So that's what you want to be really doing. Or maybe your framework is something that needs to be like defined, or people don't just regularly understand it, and so you need to break it down more so that people even know what it is. And so then you're able to take that time to break it down so that people can even understand it. So that would be the next thing, is take those pieces from your framework. If you can break down one piece from your framework and break it down even deeper and take one element of it and then shift beliefs on that piece, then that would be really good as well. So if you don't call it a framework, you can call it a system, but or your pillars or whatever. So that would be the second way that you can never run out of content again, is for you to use your framework, use those pieces in your framework, shift beliefs, myth bust things people believe about what you do, and make a case for why people would need each part of your framework. Okay, so the last part, the last thing that you can do to never run out of podcast ideas, content ideas, is to make episodes around the objections that people have for working with you. So if there's something that you hear commonly, this is a way that you can be communicating your value beyond what people are thinking. So maybe people think that this isn't going to work for them. Maybe you're a course creator, and what you hear a lot is how people don't want to buy courses anymore because they don't go through them. So how can you use your podcast content? How can you create an episode around making the case or making them think differently about courses, or making them think, how could this work for me, when they already have this idea and this objection that it's not going to work for me because it's a course? Or if it's objections around time, or something for me that's really common is, or like, our objections around tech. So I can create an episode that really shifts people's beliefs or change their mind about how hard they think the tech of starting a podcast is. So that is a big objection for me. So pick some objections that you commonly hear. Again, it's about listening to what your audience is saying. It's about keeping a bank of content of what people are saying back to you, what objections you're getting. Ask your audience. I've done plenty of posts before that are like, why haven't you started your podcast yet? And people will give me all of the reasons. And so I could go through all those reasons and then start creating content around those. So those are really valuable episodes, again, to shift people's beliefs, to make them believe that they can actually attain the thing that I'm telling them that they can attain, to make them believe that my system is why that will work for them, to shift how they're believing about it, so that they are in a place where they feel more confident to actually buy. So I hope that helps, and I will see you in the next episode.
Hey, if you enjoyed the show, head over to podcastthatpays.com to get started on your way to creating a podcast that pays. And don't forget to follow this show and take a screenshot that you were listening and tag me on Instagram at Angie M. Jordan. I'd love to meet you and show you some love over there. Thank you so much for being here. I love you. Let's get this money.